Hi everyone, I'm Natalie Alexander and welcome to the Commons here at the UN Library and Archives Geneva and to our playlist, The Journey to the Summit of the Future. Here at the library we created this playlist to be able to dive into some of the substance and the key issues around multilateralism and global governance that's going to be faced at the Summit of the Future in September. And there at that global meeting, global leaders are expected to agree on a new Pact for the future, looking at how global governance can be more effective and responsive to the challenges of our current generation as well as future generations. And one of the key issues that's going to be discussed is global debt and our multilateral financial architecture. How can we ensure that it's responsive and also effective for the needs of our time and a changing economic system? How can we make sure as well that finance is truly delivered to those who need it for sustainable development? Here to share our knowledge with us is the Secretary General of UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, which is now called UN Trade and Development. Secretary General Grynspan, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's really a pleasure to speak with you and to hear from you. You began at UN Trade and Development in 2021. You were the first woman to lead the organization since it was created back in 1964. So I really wanted to ask you first, share a bit more with us why you chose to dedicate your career to the public service.
Well, you know, I am the first generation born in Costa Rica. My parents were migrants. Yes. And I learned two things from that experience. First, that you need to make the effort, yes? You need to do everything in your power to thrive and, in such difficult circumstances. But the other thing I learned is that is not enough, that individual effort is not enough, that the society has to provide the basis for you to be able to thrive, for you to be able, with your effort, to do a dignified living for yourself and your family. And Costa Rica gave my family that. And so I felt that commitment to public policy and to service from a very early age, since I understood that Costa Rica really gave me and my family, me and my sisters, the opportunity to do that, to study, to be healthy, and to be in a society that valued you as a person and as a human being.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And actually, you are now the Secretary General of UN Trade and Development, but before that, you had various roles in Costa Rica, among them being Vice President of Costa Rica. Could you share with us briefly some defining moments that you remember along the way to getting here?
Well, imagine, coming into public life and political life was in itself, a huge step in my life, yes. But when I was elected vice president, it's an election, it's not an appointment. That was a defining moment for me. First of all, because I knew the country in a way that probably I never knew before. And the contact with the people, with the communities, really changed my life. And the respect that came with that interaction, the respect for their lives, for what they did, for what they were, able to do for the country, for the society at large, really drove me, in my other international journey afterwards. The contact with the people.
Yeah.
That was really, the most important part.
And now you're a leader here in the UN system. So I wanted to ask you a bit more about UN Trade and Development, also especially for those who don't know what it is. To put it into context, it's part of the UN system. It's a permanent intergovernmental body established by the UN General Assembly. Tell us a bit more about why it was created, but also what is its role today?
Well, it was created for the same reasons we need it today.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I have to say that. It was created to really address the inequalities, the asymmetries that were in the international trade system and the international economic system, for developing countries to be able to make development possible for their people and the well-being of their populations. And today we have the same problem, yes? How do we build a system that will allow all countries and all peoples of the world to really make it happen, in terms of development, of opportunities, of decent employment, of health and education for their children. And trade is a very important factor. And for the developing world, trade continues to be a very important opportunity to sustainable growth. But it doesn't happen automatically. The norms, the standards, the policies that we all decide together in how that system can be less asymmetric and in that sense less unequal. And today we confront the same objective, the same challenge.
Yeah, so UN Trade and Development continues. You mentioned the need is still the same as when it was created in 1964. At the same time, our world has changed drastically in terms of our economic environment, the climate crisis, our political situations also around the world have changed. How do you think UN Trade and Development has adapted to be able to still work and be effective in this different environment we're facing?
Well, to say that trade continues to be an important way for development and an important factor for development is not to say that it's the same trade. Yes, it's a different trade. It's a different economic system today. First of all, because the South has come up. There is a rise of the South in a way. And South-South trade is much more important today than it was in 1964. So there is something there that is happening. There is a rebirth, in a way, of regionalism as an important way to be able to insert yourself with more value added in the international trade. A commodity dependence is not a way for development. It cannot produce the jobs and the opportunities that the new generations that are more educated need to, for their well-being. So trade today is more South-South than it was before, but it's also more digital. It is more and more service-oriented. High-value services are taking a bigger part. And obviously green goods. The energy transition will really change, a lot of the productive structures and the possibilities of trade looking forward. And so these three factors, more services, more digital, and more green, will be the factors that will determine trade for the future.
Yeah. When you say those three factors, you could see them as both challenges but also opportunities. The climate crisis impacting the global south and developing countries even more, but it also is an opportunity for the multilateral trading system to evolve and change to adapt to that.
I think that we have a huge opportunity. And I think that for Africa, for example, that is the continent of the reserves of the critical minerals that are needed for the energy transition, is a huge opportunity. The real question is if we will learn from the past, if we will go only for the extractive, the extraction of the raw materials from these countries with no value added, without inserting them in a different way in the value chain, without giving them the opportunity to upgrade technologically, we will be commodity dependent and they won't be able to take advantage of this opportunity. If we will do the right thing, if we will have the policies and the financing and the international system will come in their support for training, for skills development, for investment in value-added activities, so probably we will have a much better world in the future.
Yeah, you mentioned international financing, and that's going to be the crux of our conversation today. But before we get there, I wanted to quickly also speak with you about one of the roles that UN Trade and Development espouses, and that's working to renew and revitalize multilateralism and stave off backlash against globalization and declining trust in the multilateral trading system. Tell us a bit about this. Why do you think there is a backlash against the multilateral trading system, and why should we believe in it?
Well, the first backlash is because developed countries are going into industrial policy, and also we see a rise in protectionism. Yes? And I remember in the 80s that, many were saying, well, the best industrial policy is the one that doesn't exist. We in UNCTAD don't believe in that. But it was the mantra for a long time. And now these same countries are saying, no, we need industrial policy. And with industrial policy also comes a different strategic role for the state. So the state is back and industrial policy is back. Those are not bad things, are good things. But the problem is that the developed world and the rich countries have the resources to go through industrial policy with subsidies. But the developing countries don't have the fiscal space to be able to do that. And so we are in a disadvantage in the developing world. We need to do industrial policy in a different way. And so we want to ask for the trade norms and framework to be more flexible so we can add value, as I said before, in the way we are inserted in the international economy, in the supply chains. And so many countries are using their leverage in terms of the raw materials and the critical materials that are needed for the green transformation, as leverage to ask for that added value from foreign direct investment. And there is a tension there, between these two ways of going about industrial policy. Just to finish, let me say that protectionism is a problem for the developing world because, we just had this celebration of the Aid for Trade event, and program. And it's because open markets for many of the products of the developing countries are the way to help them most. It's not aid, it's trade. And so protectionism can hurt countries, in the developing world.
Yeah. Looking at the idea of protectionism and the summit of the future, a lot of the substance leading into it is how we can revitalize multilateralism to help people understand how global governance works, but also to keep gaining more trust in multilateralism, because we're seeing a lot of feedback on distrust around global governance at the moment. So let's dive into that. The Summit of the Future is being informed by a range of recommendations. We have the SG Secretary General's policy briefs that look at different issues for the summit, as well as the high-level advisory board, the HLAB's report on effective multilateralism. There are two papers that really look at financing and the financial architecture. One is the SG's policy brief on reforms to the international financial architecture, and also the HLAB's recommendation on ensuring sustainable finance for all. What's uniting them both? Both papers see some really core issues with our current multilateral financial architecture. There are structural deficiencies and also issues of access and equity. Let's look first at the structural aspects. The papers describe them as outdated, unsuitable for today. What do you think are the most urgent structural deficiencies that we need to address to be able to support moving away from protectionism?
Let me divide this in two. Yes. First is why multilateralism? Yes. And my question is, what is the alternative? The alternative to multilateralism is fragmentation or a power game. And if you are not a powerful country, how do you play that game? So you become a victim of the system. So the only way for the countries not to become victims of a system is to have a voice in the rules-based international system that we want to build together and to build it together. So that is what multilateralism is about. If it's only about the power game, you don't need multilateralism. The powerful will dictate the norms. The issue is to be inclusive, to have a voice for those that cannot play in their advantage the power game. That's why multilateralism is important. Also in trade, the small and medium-sized countries don't have the same voice as the powerful. And so they are banned bound to fail if multilateralism is not there to protect the common interest. And so that's why governance is so important. And that is why, in the Summit of the Future, we are saying we need a system that will include the voices of those that were not present when the system was built. Because when the UN came to life and when the international financial system, the Bretton Woods institutions came to life, most of the countries of Africa were not independent. So there is something to be looked at, and there is a widening of the inclusiveness of the voices of these countries that we need today for a better governance. Yeah. That's one part of your question. Now, let me go to the international financial institutions and what we think is important. And there are three words that we have to remember: liquidity, investment, and debt. Those are the three things that we want to work better for the developing world. With respect to liquidity, is because when you have a shock, the pandemic, the COVID-19, okay, it was a shock for everybody, yes? But the developed countries that have the dollar or the euro, they could emit, with their central banks. But what a country like Costa Rica can do, or what a country like even the middle-income countries of Africa, Kenya, or Zambia, or Ghana can do, they cannot emit. So they need liquidity to be able to respond to the shock. Was the shock their fault? No, it wasn't. Yes? It happened. And it impacted their economies. It impacted their populations. And they didn't have the means to face that challenge appropriately unless there is international support. And that's why in certain moments when there is a shock, you need liquidity. Now, the other thing is debt. You can go. If you don't have the liquidity, what do? You go for debt. And so the debt of these countries really escalated during the pandemic. And now they have to pay. And the interest rates went up. Was that their fault? No, it wasn't. But still, they have to pay a very costly debt. And so they face impossible decisions. What do? Do you pay your debt, or do you invest in education or in health? And that's many of these countries are confronted today with that decision. 3.3 billion people live in countries that pay more in servicing the debt than the investment in education or health. So that is really the problem that we want to solve. Yeah. We need a system that will be able to allow these countries to face these challenges that are systemic challenges. It's not bad behavior from their side. It's systemic shocks that put them in this position.
How can, in your view, what are the key issues that must be addressed at the summit to ensure that countries everywhere in need have access to liquidity, have equity in terms of that access, and are able to then also effectively have support for the debt they face? What are the key issues here that we need to address at the summit? What can help solve this?
Okay, in terms of debt, we are asking for a system, an institutional system that will be stable and permanent, not ad hoc, programs to face the debt. That is what we have right now. So the common framework that the G20 put forward was a step in the right direction, but is not a stable institutional setting and is not able to really confront the problem in its magnitude. So we have to recognize, first, that there is a problem, and second, that we need a process that will be stable and known and transparent to face the debt problem. First point. Second point, we need a multilateral development network that will be able to allow these countries to have the financing for the sustainable development goals and for the green transition. And for that, we need that system to be able to have the scale that we need. And right now, they don't have the scale. And, they have become small for the challenge. So we need to allow more instruments for these, for the multilateral development banks at the global level, at the regional level, to be able to come and make the scale financing that the countries need. And third, we need the private sector to come in. And so we need a system that will lower the perception of risks in the developing world. So, foreign direct investment is not coming to the developing countries. It's going down, actually, and aid is going down. So where the money is going to come from? So we need a system of guarantees and probably also of the perception in terms of these countries, because the perception is looking at these countries as more risky than they are. And we think that the system has to be balanced so we can have public money from the multilateral system coming in, but also crowding in private investment to make it happen at the scale that we all need.
Would this also mean that how we define multilateralism then does change? So it's not just how we currently see it traditionally as member states, but we see a wider multilateral system that includes more the private sector.
Yeah, absolutely true. But I think that in the voice that we want to be heard, probably in the Summit of the Future, is also that you need the public institutions of the world, that is the global governance, to really play the role. And we want better and bigger Bretton Woods institutions. And we want better and bigger regional banks. Because if they don't do their part, it will be very difficult to bring the private sector in for the benefit of the developing world.
Yeah, and connecting to that, you mentioned how the governance aspects and how important that is for inclusivity and diversity. Could you touch a bit more on that? In the papers, there's quite a lot of thought on diversifying the institutions we have in terms of governance, the IMF and the World Bank. How can we make these institutions more inclusive and representative, like you said, of nations everywhere?
If I am not mistaken, let me give you this number. When they were created, I think that they represented 44 countries and they had 12 seats. Now we have 24 seats in the governance bodies of the IMF, and they have included now as another seat for Sub-Saharan Africa. And so if you will do, if the same proportion will have been maintained today, you will have more than 50 seats in the governing bodies. We are not advocating for 50 seats. Probably that is too much. But no doubt that between 24 and 50 there is a room for improvement for the voice of the countries that were not present at the moment of the Bretton Woods, when the Bretton Woods institutions were established. So I think that there is room for more inclusiveness of the developing world and the voice of the countries that are not fully represented as they should in the governance of the Bretton Woods institutions.
Yeah.
But that will mean a rebalancing of power. And that is a difficult conversation. But that is why it's so important to have it now.
Yeah. As I wanted to also share with you a bit about the thoughts on global debt. So you mentioned, and UN Trade and Development is very vocal about global debt and how we can support this through better trade and sustainable financing for that. Coming back to a few figures, because you mentioned COVID, the shocks since 2020 have pushed many countries over the edge. 9 least developed countries and other low-income countries are currently in debt distress, with 27 others in high risk. Almost 40% of all developing countries suffer from severe debt problems and are home to 40% of all people living in extreme poverty. These are really concerning figures. Coming back down to UN Trade and Development, What is your response to this in terms of global debt, and how can UN trade and development play a part in activating this, responding to this, and also ensuring that this is reformed? How we deal with this?
You know, we started with the Global Crisis Response Group and in creating awareness about the problem of debt. And I think that we have gone a long way in these 2 years. And the material that we have produced, first of all, to show the evidence, because the evidence was not out there. So we were, I think, a very important player in showing the evidence and showing the data and disaggregating the data. So we created awareness in the world for the discussion of the debt problem. Still is a struggle because, as we say, markets are not in crisis. The countries are, but the markets are not. And so the urgency is not felt like we did feel it maybe in the 80s or in the financial crisis of 2008. Now people are suffering, but markets are not. So it is the voice of the UN, the only one that is really pushing, for the recognition that this is a central problem, and we are calling it a crisis of development. Because of what we said before, it's a crisis of development because countries cannot pay the debt and develop at the same time.
Yeah. There are some big issues to be discussed at the summit and hopefully agreed on. With regard to the international financial architecture reforms, what do you think will be the most challenging in terms of achieving consensus at the summit on these issues?
I think that it's very important to agree on what the draft is putting forward right now, and to understand that the voice of the UN is important in these issues. We understand that the IMF, that the World Bank, that the regional banks have their own board system and governance system. And many of the decisions for operationalizing what we are saying will have to be taken in those rooms, in those boards. But the capacity of the UN to send a clear message that something has to change and that the changes have to go in this direction is essential. And I expect the countries to agree that the voice of the UN is important in these issues, and marginalizing the UN won't help anybody. Yeah. So that's what I expect in the Summit of the Future.
Secretary General Grynspan, thank you so much for joining us today. If you have a final word for our audience, for your hopes for the summit and beyond the summit, we'd love to hear them.
In the world we have a deficit of trust, but also a deficit of hope. And I think that both things and that gap can be closed in the Summit of the Future. The Summit of the Future is an opportunity to build trust in the multilateral system, but also to create hope that we can do things different and better for the populations of the world.